We are the most We're basically Joe Rogan.
Basically. Alright, we are live. Hello again, everyone. Welcome to a casual chat with Rupert August. Would everyone like to introduce themselves?
I am Henry.
I am hanging from the candelabra, Simon.
I didn't think of a funny thing for myself. I'm Kurtz.
Okay, jolly good. So, today we will be discussing British values, an oft denigrated, I suppose, topic. And a lot of people claim, possibly semi-rightly, to not know what British values are. I say semi-rightly because, number one, it's been deliberately obfuscated and manipulated in places, I would say. And also, there's just the factor of, would a fish know what water is? It's kind of hard to see what a culture is when you're kind of swimming in it.
You're really swinging hard right off the bat, aren't you?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, it's probably good to explain where, like, the perspective that we're coming from. But I'm sure you guys will be a little bit less incendiary than I will about it, probably. I don't know.
Yes and no. I mean, I think I'm just going to talk from a more historical context, I suppose.
Yeah, so am I, probably. Because it's kind of hard. Well, it's easier to see, looking back, what British values are, and then kind of applying them forward where they've been consistent, which is probably the methodology that I'm going to take. So, would anybody like to start, or anybody else like to start, or shall I?
I will start.
Alright, sure.
But start with something different. Because I think the thing that you see most when you look at British values, especially when it's talked about on YouTube, amongst the likes of more libertarian types like Sargon of Akkad and I don't know, take your pick, the Britisher maybe, I guess. They seem to ascribe this value set that doesn't seem to hold very well when you look further back in time, and these ideas of like liberty and freedom of the individual, and like fairness, rule of law, things like that. And some of them, you could make arguments for, but so I don't think. My point being, I don't think the empire the country that formed the empire that covered most of the world and enslaved a lot of people doing so, really cared all that much about liberty and personal freedoms, if you ask me.
Well, they did, but in a specific context. It's like the Confederacy also would have, did value freedom and personal freedom and all that kind of thing. It's just within a certain context.
Well, yeah, I suppose it's more freedom for themselves and their countrymen rather than freedom in general.
I mean, they probably just had a different definition for, different definitions of liberty and such, and also different definitions for who that was relevant for. So now we look at things in a very generic kind of man kind of sense, but that would have been somewhat more alien in the past when you're trying to apply that to the past.
In what way?
Well, again, so certain things would only apply to Christians, for example.
Right.
If you go on.
Also, as much as you're trying to justify by differences, hypocrisy is a thing.
True.
Sure. But, I mean, we're gonna... If you think that they were all thinking universally, in like universalist kind of egalitarian terms, then you're probably looking at how these people thought in the wrong way. Like, it's not just hypocrisy. I just don't think that... not that I don't think it occurred to them, but that it wasn't a relevant consideration because they recognized differences between different people types and thought that they should be treated differently.
Yeah. And I think if you go even further back, if you go, I don't know, back to the Middle Ages, is that as far back as we can really go and still think of this as a continuous British people with continuous values? I don't really know.
That would be where I would argue it basically starts, actually. So with Edward III, because he was trying to deliberately take a people which didn't necessarily have a unified sense of itself as an English people and combine it into something that was new, but more importantly, definitively not French, because he wanted to use those knights in particular to then go and invade France and have that be a unified, coherent entity. Because what he'd learnt from previous times, perhaps explicitly or implicitly, was that having just a bunch of sort of French nobility in France, having a lot to do with various parts of the rule of England and to do with the English crown, was not necessarily a recipe for stability, because they viewed their relationship with England as not being something set in stone. It was more just kind of transient and politically useful or not, as the case may be. And therefore they start looking for perhaps relationships with the Crown of France or something like that, if they feel that they're not being treated correctly by the throne of England. And that becomes much more of a realistic prospect. So going into the 100 Years' War, what you had was a definitively English warrior identity. That's why we have the Cross of St. George as our patron saint. It's deliberately crafted as a warrior culture, which can then be used to conquer France.
Yeah, feel like that's a bit of a tangent from British values, but I understand where you're coming from.
I wouldn't necessarily say it is a tangent, because it's because to have it built on that firm foundation of A, not being French, and B, like having a very significant warrior ethic is kind of important for how things develop from there.
I suppose, but I guess in my head I've always had it as an argument that a lot of British values are based on Christendom.
Yeah, to a great extent. So yeah, you're looking at like a Christian warrior ethic, and I mean, again, it's the Cross of St. George, so a Christian warrior patron saint, and again, the Cross of St. George is our flag in England. So yeah, that kind of tells you everything you need to know about the baseline and what he was going for quite deliberately with that starting point, which then builds up from there. In fact, I would probably argue that in a lot of ways the aristocracy didn't change in that regard. It stayed relatively militaristic and acted as a kind of military caste that could be tapped into whenever needed in war, right up until World War I and II.
So, how much of that do you reckon filtered out into the general populace? Because I believe we talked about before about how about how we used to have a lot more of a top-down society and top-down culture.
I would say that the culture definitely filtered down more than things filtered up, although there were definitely things that filtered up. In the case of particularly probably the middle-class sensibilities for moralizing, which I would say definitely comes out of the Reformation era and then carries on into the Victorian era. So when you think about things like Victorian morality, more often than not what you're talking about there is middle class sensibilities, because they become very kind of moralizing. I mean, that was Dickens' prime demographic that he was aiming for with most of his writings. The kind of people who were going to be looking at these situations of say child labor or child poverty and stuff like that, orphans, and who would be just looking for a reason to kind of feel bad about something in society and then try to push to change it or something.
Make myself tangent. It's also why I ended up retroactively really disliking the guy, because he made poorhouses look bad. But anyway.
Yeah, the reason that poorhouses got shut down was actually because they were effectively not providing their original intent of simultaneously helping out the poor by giving guaranteed employment. It just ended up being a place to put people who couldn't get any other job. So thus, you were getting no usable labour out of it. So it just ended up being, a form of welfare, just outright welfare as we would understand it, rather than what they intended it to be in the first place. Which is kind of interesting, because you don't really associate it that way. But it goes further back than that. The kind of moralizing ethic, insofar as this was effectively the demographic that was most supportive of, like, the parliamentarian cause, for example. You're talking about an urban Protestant moralizing group of a lot of the time merchants in in some very urban sphere who were very conscious about certain, spiritual and moral matters, and thus they did things like banning Christmas and stuff like that, even though the aristocracy wasn't on side with that, the poor weren't on side with that, and a lot of times people who made up the government weren't on side with that, even Cromwell himself, but they were pushing for it because of their moral imperatives.
So what you're saying is that as much as you come up with these ideas for British values, and the kind of lowest rungs on the ladder are usually okay with it, the aristocracy is okay with it, the government framework is okay with it, but then British values get sort of weirdly co-opted and maybe taken to extremes by a middle class.
Yes, a lot of the time. I would say that, it's implicit in everything that I've been saying so far, but I would definitely say that British values, to me, would be very stratified along a social class along social class lines. So you've got the aristocracy, who are quite different from the middle class, who are quite different from the working class or the poor. And the poor, because I haven't mentioned them yet so much, I would say that they are generally more libertine, often quite a bit more sort of jingoistic and nationalistic, and generally I would say relatively not necessarily politically active per se when they can help it. They just kind of want to get on with their own lives and just enjoy things, as long as the government isn't getting in the way of things like their consumption of alcohol and enjoyment of plays or whatever music hall kind of entertainment. If you're looking at this from a Victorian perspective, that kind of thing.
What you're saying is that I should be moralizing more.
No, I'm just saying, well, if you want to, but I would say that's what marks out the middle class most definitively. Traditionally it's also been a major investing class, and so they've had a lot of power, like sort of decentralized power over industry of various sorts, and so they've also been caught up in a lot of the financial speculations and such, and making up a large portion of the investors in empire in various ways. But treating it in a sort of arm's length kind of fashion. And I'm also, by extension, saying that the kind of people who are doing all this sort of statue tearing down and all that kind of thing and pushing social justice, it's basically the same group of people that it's always been, going back to the Victorian era. And so in some ways that is you could look at this through the lens of a kind of class war going on, except not the class war that they would identify. It's the middle class versus everyone else.
To pull things a bit more back on, well, not so much back on track, but to bring things to a more simplified perspective right now, what would we all say are British values, and which ones do we think have remained consistent over time?
Well, would somebody else like to take the floor? So it's not just me talking for half an hour?
Yeah, I'll step up to play. I've been quiet for a while. I suppose I feel like of late this has certainly been subverted a lot. That what a lot of people would consider to be British values just asked, like sort of spring the question on them. Probably struggle to answer you at first, but would say things along the lines of tolerance and acceptance and things that I don't necessarily think are true. I'd sooner try and relate them back to an older English values would be things like religion, the community that comes with it surrounding the church, and the moralizing of the middle class, as Rupert has pointed out earlier. But I think certainly, and this would, our lifetime specifically has been altered a lot. It's what most people probably think of being British values now aren't necessarily historically what would be considered British values.
So I think part of the reason I proposed this was because it's something that's always seemed a bit elusive to me. It's not something that I've ever really had a concrete answer. It's always been I don't know. I suppose sort of difficult to put a pin in. and say, yes, these are these things. Sum up in a sentence, I suppose, is the thing that I struggle doing. And I think that I think, yeah, as Kurtz was saying, I agree with most of the things that he's identified. Things I would add, I suppose, are this sense of not necessarily nationalistic pride, but just pride in the nation, just the pride of something the country has achieved in general. I think it's something that most people who, at least if they're born there, can take pride in knowing that, we beat the Nazis, or it's a bit of a more contentious topic, but things like having some of the largest empire in the world. It's nice to be able to take pride in having what's the word, like a leading, the leading edge on the world stage. Am I making sense?
I was going to suggest that you take pride in being a continuation of that lineage.
Yeah, exactly. And I had another point, but I've forgotten it now, so come back to me.
To maybe narrow down what you say when it seems elusive, it does seem like British sometimes British values is used as kind of like a buzzword almost, as like a buzzword term, and very nebulous at times what that even means, because we currently live in an age of the ever shifting goalposts. So it's like, well, what even are these values anymore? And that's why I kind of asked if there was anything that was kept consistent. And I'd say the one thing that seemed to be kind of kept consistent, at least until recently, was a sort of nationalist zeal. But that seems to have kind of like puffed up in smoke since World War II.
Hatred of the French.
Well, I mean, that goes back
there's
to
something consistent.
that is one thing about the, I suppose that you could say the continuation all the way from Edward III, is that viewing ourselves as definitively not European is, or away from continental Europe is something that I think has defined us for most of our history, and that continues through to today, obviously, being that we got Brexit.
Yeah.
And also, I noticed that even amongst the relatively non-political, you've got people saying, no, I am not a citizen of the world, I am a citizen of the United Kingdom.
Although that doesn't necessarily mark it out as a British value in and of itself. That's just a factor of being provincial, I would say. So I should add that in order for something to be a British value, I would probably say that it has to be something which is, discrete and not just a factor, and not particularly not something that's claimed to be a trait of all, or like a value of all cultures or all nations. Because if everyone is just tolerant and values equality, then no one does. That's because, well, not that no one does, but that it's not a value. It's just like a universal thing that is not discrete between different groups. It's not, you couldn't call that a British value if everyone is supposed to have that value.
So both our overt and covert hatred of the French is kind of a British value, is it?
I mean, sure, maybe.
I think another thing to add, I suppose, to the list is a sometimes overt, sometimes less so, feeling of superiority. And to give an example, or a general area in which I'm thinking of, but I know it extends to other areas, this idea of when Americans spell things wrong. Obviously it's wrong, it's not just a different way. It's the British way is right. They're doing it differently, therefore they're doing it wrong. And I think it's probably where, or maybe an extension of, I don't know which way around it goes, but an extension of why we sort of joined in on this idea of spreading freedom and democracy. It's the way that we do it. It must be the best way of doing it, therefore we'll spread it, the best way of doing it. And we'll go and enlighten those poor savages, because they're not doing it our way.
Yeah, something that I think, especially in the recent, in the recent wave of destroying statues because slavery and everything, is that I believe it was technically France that decided to abolish slavery in their country, whereas when we decided to do it in Britain, it wasn't enough that it was done in Britain. It was like, now we must spread this to the entire world. It must be abolished everywhere because we've abolished it, which is, I think, is conveniently forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
And also, incidentally, about people getting things wrong, I did have an American friend explain to me that he was trying to make tea, and for some reason he used a single tea bag in a pint glass.
Disgusting.
Obviously doing it wrong. It's not the British way.
But that's just not the way you do it, period, is it?
Mm-hmm.
I think it is worth noting, though, what the superiority is in. So if we think that we have a superiority complex of some kind, then what is that superiority in? Because I wouldn't say that is unique to Britain either, or England. I would say most nations consider themselves to have a superiority in something, at least. It's just a case of what that actually is in relation to other countries.
The thing is that when Britain says it's superior, it's right.
Consensus getting very circular very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But okay, for example, France is probably going to get quite, or get a bit of a superiority complex in regards to their food, or maybe Italy. That's one of France's things, or in the case of Italy, you might talk about finely crafted goods or something, just because there's so many luxury brands of clothing in particular come from Italy.
I was about to say France is definitely more a culinary thing, whereas Italy is very much proud of their artisanal goods, whether it be food or clothing, as you say.
Yeah.
Whereas we're just everything else.
No, everything and including. They're wrong when they think they're the best.
I think.
Okay, in all seriousness,
I think it's definitely in terms of our. I would say our culture, in terms of things like language and theatre and things like that. So, I think the biggest time you get caught up with, obviously they're doing it wrong. Going back to the idea of Americans, is it's the same language. It's still English. They're just spelling it wrong or saying a word weirdly in their country bumpkin way.
I suppose I also maybe think, if I'm trying to be serious about an idea of British superiority, maybe it's, rather than specifically being like we're superior X thing, it's the idea that we reckon we go we used to reckon we go places and we provide some form of enlightenment.
Yeah. So like superiority of ideas and like worldview and philosophy, I suppose.
Yeah, like it's not.
Is that? Oh, sorry, go on.
So it's like when I said we had it in our heads that not only would we abolish slavery, we would also have everybody else abolish it because we are superior in our ideas or something along those lines. Not saying that's true now anymore, but maybe that's a value, maybe it isn't.
I think we are fairly outward looking in terms of so you look at a country like Japan, for example. We go back to them a lot, and there's a lot of parallels you can draw between Japan and the British Isles. But they, for example, went into isolation for 100-ish years, I think, wasn't it, or longer than that? Either way, they completely. I thought. Oh, anyway, it was a while, and they completely shut themselves out. Didn't want anything to do with anyone else. They just were like, okay, our culture, our resources, our country, I guess. We don't need anything else. Whereas, and it's not like they had a lot of resources to begin with. It is, yeah. But you get a country like England where it wouldn't dream of doing that. Why would we just sit isolated on our own little island when we can go and, I don't know, we can go and trade with our neighbours. We can go and make friends, make enemies, assert our dominance in certain areas. I don't know if it's even something that crossed our minds. Like, the only time that I think of us being particularly isolationist is in war, when we'd use our superior navy to stop them getting to the mainland, to the homeland.
Well, even that's not an isolation. Pardon me, not an isolationist perspective. It's just a factor of.
It's a defensive strategy.
Yeah, it's a defensive strategy. You could kind of say that there's some amount of that in the kind of late 19th century with the ideas of glorious isolation. I think it was called glorious isolation. Basically, that Europe was going to do what it was going to do, and Britain could just happily stay out of it. But that's still in the context of running an empire. So it was not a case of we're going to stay out of the affairs of the rest of the world, and they're hopefully going to stay out of our affairs. It's a case of we don't want to get involved in specifically European great power affairs, but everything around the edge of that we're still going to do, and we're also still going to trade with them. It's just that we're not going to actively get involved in their wars and their alliance system.
Yeah, but doesn't that show then that how external focused we are? The fact that it's a big deal that we stopped meddling in other people's business.
Yeah, I agree. We are very outward-looking, I would say.
Right.
But okay, to go back a little bit on what I laid out, is there anything? Well, do you have any comments on it? Would you tweak it in any particular way, or the way that I stratified everything?
Well, so my comment of it while you were talking was more. You said quite a few times about how it changed at a certain period of time, which I can't remember what you were saying. It's something about in the Victorian time. It's too long ago. It's been like 10 minutes. But so this idea of not necessarily like constant change, but that was quite interesting to me. Especially when we're talking about this in terms of looking back and trying to find common theme. It depends how far back you go to, I suppose, to put as a point of, is that a British value or not? So, for example, if you're going to say that things changed in the Victorian times, what's stopping you saying? I'm really struggling with my words. What's stopping you from saying that this current wave of neoliberal Marxism going on at the moment? Why is that not a British value if you're accepting that these things are changing constantly?
Oh, I was saying that it basically was a British value because it's coming from the middle class value of moralising.
Gross.
Except that it's not about the ideas that they're pushing per se. It's about the fact that they are pushing some like very specific and highly moralising set of ideas and trying to call you a bad person for not adhering to them. It's that particular thing in isolation, not the fact that what they're actually pushing, i.e. all the anti-racism inquisition and the diversity and inclusion and all that kind of stuff. Multiculturalism. That's not the British value in itself. It's the stuff that's informing that, the attitudes that are informing that and causing those people to like push some new. I mean, in the past it was on a religious grounds, and arguably it still is. It's just obviously it's a more atheistic religion if that's what you want to call it, but it comes from the same place, I would say. And in terms of the values changing in the past, I wouldn't necessarily say that the values have changed all that much. It's more just a case of who has been, I guess, forming the dominant cultural position at any one time. So, in particular, you would see during the time period that we associate with the Victorians most closely, with all of the moralising and such, that is very specifically attributable to the middle class being quite dominant. Whereas there are other periods where the aristocracy were more dominant, and there are other periods where the working class were more dominant, at least in terms of the cultural attitudes and what was being, raised up, or what we remember about that particular era. So in particular, I guess I would say something like the the Thatcher years were more dominated by the working class dispositions, because it was very much more going down that angle of going down the line of we're going to try and hands off in as much as possible, but we're not necessarily going to have too strict. We're going to start loosening kind of moral considerations a little bit, and we're not going to. It was kind of more of a libertarian period in a lot of ways, and I think that is more what the British working class have traditionally gone for. It's more complicated than that, but specifically on the on like the moral expectations and things, they are comparably loose, I would say, for the working class. I guess more recently, I would struggle to think of a period that's dominated by the aristocracy. It's probably the early 19th century, I'd say, where the affairs of the aristocracy are really not. So think like the Napoleonic period, when you have a very outward-looking, but quite militaristic and, concerned with doing things like preserving international stability and things like that. So getting involved in the situation in France when they were being all revolutionary and, killing their king and letting things get terribly out of control. And then, shutting all that down.
Sorry, just understatement of that century, definitely. Things getting a bit out of control, like very out of control. Sorry, just as another, just more, food for thought kind of thing on, values and things is, one thing that very sticks in my mind, and maybe it's because it's been relatively recent over the last couple of generations, is the, you always see it in the form of the poster, which is the, keep calm and carry on, and basically almost like a stoic attitude that came about during World War II, well, not even necessarily World War II, but Depression, World War II, and the rationing period that still went on afterwards. Would you say that this is kind of like, I almost want to say tough it out attitude, would you say that's kind of like a British value or not?
Yes, I would probably say so. Although in particular what sticks out about that for me would be the stiff upper lip angle in so far as not being particularly showy either, I guess, which doesn't necessarily seem immediately connected, but in terms of that idea of being, perhaps hardworking, getting on with it, and not necessarily being too caught up in either emotion or show, per se.
And I suppose you'd attribute that more to the working class sort of people, wouldn't you?
I think that actually applies relatively well to all three classes, because I think if you compare them to their continental peers, for example, then all strata of British society have been a bit more reserved, I would say.
Okay, so
go ahead, Henry. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, in terms of what we've talked about today, which would you say? So would you say that a lot of these things we've talked about apply to all the stratas equally, or more to the different classes, or would you say that? So for example, the I can't remember. Let's be honest. So yeah, so what would you say? Just go down the list if you want. Would be attributed more to which strata? Or would you say that they are more similar than different? I suppose is what I'm trying to ask.
And there's definitely conflict between them in a lot of different areas. So, I guess in the interest of not retreading ground, it would be more relevant to possibly talk about the things that they have in common, because I've already talked about the stuff that I think that they have as distinct from one another. So there's the reservedness, I would say, that is fairly universal to all of them. That sense of ideas superiority, I suppose, that probably applies to all of them. The sense of not being continental, the sense of being apart from the continent, continental Europe. Anything else you guys can think of? Sorry?
So, well, from what I'm getting from that, you're saying that apart from the differences you've obviously prescribed. Most of the things we've said will apply to all strata.
Mostly, yeah, I would say. I would say the idea of the kind of ideas superiority, but applied to the moral sphere particularly applies much more to the middle class, or they are much more focused on that particular aspect, that they think that their way of doing things is the best and everyone should conform. For kind of, I think the word would be deontological reasons.
Sorry, just in regards to a moralizing middle class, is that kind of universal across all cultures, or would you say that's a very strictly British thing?
I would say that's much more British than it applies to other groups. I don't think you can see quite the same phenomenon elsewhere. I mean, I'm less familiar with other cultures, obviously, but I don't see as much of that coming out of France, to be honest.
So how much do we think then, since we've talked about British values for a while, how much do we think that applies to the rest of the Anglosphere? Because I personally think that, while you get a lot of similarities, you do see a lot of deviation, especially in America, and to a lesser degree in places like Canada, where they keep some. I don't know if it's most or not of the sort of core British values, a lot of things we talked about. But I think that they do deviate a bit.
Yeah, I think they all ended up being skewed in one way or another. So, as ever, the United States is the odd one out. That I think they definitely got more on the side of the middle class ethic, I suppose, and a little bit of the working class ethic as well. Quite a lot, I suppose, especially after the Civil War, where the people who you might, through in a very hazy kind of sense, see as European style aristocrats, when they all get sidelined post Civil War. I think that's when you really start to see the essence of the US middle class come out, to the extent that a lot of the time what becomes the elite in the US is in fact just a richer middle class.
Sorry, just to go back to Henry's question about deviations along the Anglosphere and everything. I do feel like the deviations are significant enough to argue that these are different cultures, like they're very different from British ones, because I feel like all other English-speaking cultures compared to Britain are way more showy than Britain is, and you are not quite on that. Like I said, like keep calm and carry on, or not being so outwardly showy. I think is actually I think that's where things deviate a lot. Like, I think when you say it deviates, it's like saying, oh, they've deviated a little, when I would argue they've deviated a lot. But then while they have deviated a lot, it's not like we've become incompatible. I'd imagine our cultures are all still relatively compatible with one another.
Yeah, I would definitely emphasize the compatibility, but I definitely think that they lean towards. So each country, I would say, leans towards one strata or another to some degree.
Don't suppose Kurtz has an opinion on this?
I mean, certainly I agree with the whole idea that that the Anglosphere is they lean towards certain aspects of British culture, like the Americans have certainly taken to heart the sense of superiority, but not so much the idea of being reserved. And I when you were talking about how these other countries in the Anglosphere are certainly compatible with English culture, but aren't necessarily the same, I was thinking to myself that I would more soon describe them as being originating from English culture rather than being alterations. That they are. It's more of you go back into their past and you can see how it was once an English culture transplanted from England to this other country by the migration of people, but over time has changed enough in order for it to be distinctly different, and say, okay, then Australian culture is not the same as English culture. Same roots, but ultimately different.
So I was going to say Australia is one of the examples where I'd say we're more similar than different. I think that it's not wouldn't have had I wouldn't say much at all of an influence from the indigenous people, and I think that it's not long enough of a time for them to like. There were lots of waves of migration fairly recently to Australia of British citizens, and I think that, especially when you look at, say, British and Australian people abroad, and you look at how they act, not necessarily with each other, but just in general with people around them, I think that there is definitely they're definitely very similar, and you can definitely see in the way that they act. There's I suppose if you want to call it a parent-daughter culture, then you can definitely see it there. You see the familial resemblance.
Yeah, that would probably. I mean, I too would probably want to mimic my parent culture rather than the culture of people that literally try to drink petrol.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I'd say it definitely depends on the country. And I wonder how much. Well, I wonder the reason for the deviation, I suppose, is where I want to bore a bit more. Because is it that you have British people abroad keep going with Australia, because you might as well, and they just happen to have a different mix of strata, so you have more working class people or more middle class people going over, who then end up in their version of the aristocracy, and then it changes how their upper class behave and things like that. Or is it
I would say it's basically that, yeah, what you just described.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the other influence could be, is it them trying to prove themselves on the world stage as their own, maybe not their own independent nation, but as a capable entity of its own right. Maybe that's where some of the outgoing nature happens, the idea of trying to prove themselves, if not to the people around them, but to the British Empire in general, as something that's quite capable.
To a certain extent, probably. I think this comes across more with Canada, because Canada, especially in the recent past, has definitely kind of felt itself not as significant on the world stage as it feels it ought to be, and so it tries to craft its own, unique identity in a certain sense.
By embracing frog.
No, I think more so probably by trying to be the most liberal. And so it just kind of takes the version of Anglo-liberalism that has been kind of, in some sense, parasitized by some of the newer trends that came out of the continent. Frankfurt School and all that.
Yeah, I was about to say, this sounds like a race to the bottom.
Yeah, in a lot of ways it is. It's a race to be the most kind of degenerate, end of civilization tier kind of course of events as possible. Just race down to the bottom as fast as possible.
Aye. Yeah.
So, I mean, that is something that I did want to bring across, is that it is important. So even though I've said that, yes, this moralizing angle is something that is kind of timeless for the middle class, I would say, in a lot of ways, or at least insofar as, at least as far back as the English Civil War kind of period and a little bit before. But the angle of Anglo-liberalism, particularly, likes to try and present itself as culture a lot of the time. But I don't think it is, because it comes from much more of an ideological place, even though in some ways it comes from an Anglo disposition, so it more naturally fits into Anglo cultures than it does on the continent. Case in point, once again, that little kerfuffle over on the continent called the French Revolution. Because I don't know if you know, but a lot of that stuff, a lot of the talking points in that kind of time period was along the lines of, England has a parliament, it works really well over there, we'll try and bring it over here, except we'll do it we'll do it properly instead of bowing to aristocratic pressures and whatever, and they can't necessarily take it in the moderation that that Anglos have taken it. Which actually brings on to another point that I suppose another thing that you could say that Anglos have as a kind of cultural artifact, I suppose, is moderation in a lot of different things, particularly on the cultural and like ideological side of things. Like how we conduct our politics tends to be quite moderate compared to a lot of other countries.
Okay, and to go, and again, me coming in to maybe bring back things onto the topic as well is and onto one of the things I like to reference a lot, and that's how much do you think the Enlightenment ends up informing British values over time?
Quite a lot, insofar as it's how the I'm just going to continue working with the same frame of reference. It's how the middle class came to conceptualize itself, mostly, basically, as being the champions of this kind of idea.
Alrighty then.
Any other thoughts from anyone else on how the Enlightenment affected British culture and British thoughts on things?
No.
Yep.
In silence.
That all has to stay in just for the surprise for the viewers.
Should we wrap it up? And make
I guess we have to wrap it up. Well, does anyone have any final points? Because yeah, I mean, I kind of dominated this discussion a little bit, and it's in some sense it's kind of a shame that no one else brought a kind of more complete view of British culture to kind of counteract mine a little bit. But
I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head. What you said made sense, at least to me.
I'm glad to say I don't really have any qualms with your views. That's maybe the issue here. Maybe you've just surrounded yourself with too many yes men there, Rupert.
Hell yeah, man.
Yeah, man.
Thanks, Clarkons.
Wow. Yeah,
I was going to say earlier that I've been very passive in this, been closer to being a viewer than a participant, and I mean I apologize. It's not good viewing, and it doesn't make for good conversation. But it's because, like we mentioned earlier, like right at the beginning of this conversation, like does a fish even know it's surrounded by water? Whenever I've been asked to describe a British values, it's something that I struggle to do, and this has been more of a sort of expanding my thoughts on that more than anything.
Yeah. I mean, the reason why I kind of struggled with it as a topic as well is Rupert over here being so bleeding strict with his definitions, where you can't have any overlap apparently with other cultures, because obviously most places have a value of nationalistic zeal towards itself, which makes sense. But I would definitely say that, for the British values to even function, we'd need some form of like nationalism, or at least some sort of like just a general enjoyment of being British, I suppose, would be the best way to describe it. Like, you don't have to be, I don't expect people to run around waving Union flags all the time.
But they should.
Yeah. I mean, I want a guard on every corner to make sure that people are doing that.
All right, calm down, all well. But that's kind of where I get a little bit. I guess the best word to describe it is just disappointed with our sort of like liberal moralizing middle class, where they've ended up becoming very openly self-hating towards our own nation and things like this. When it's like, I'm not asking that you love the nation as much as just, surely there is something about being British that people like. You can't just hate everything about your origin. That makes no sense.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of where I can't remember how thoroughly I got into it. It's a long time ago now. Feels like a lifetime, even though it was 5 minutes. But that basically liberalism and the Enlightenment ideas, and then how that's been built on since in more particularly recent times, has gone on to inform how the middle class moralizes and what it moralizes on. But if you were to slot in a different set of ideas, then they'd probably start moralizing about those instead. So let's say let's say fascism got entrenched in the UK, and we got our form of like moderate Anglo-fascism or something, then that would be what the middle class would start moralizing about, I suspect.
That's so fucking surreal, I've got to be honest. That's really hard for my brain to imagine.
It's weird, but I mean that's kind of what's happened this time, in our timeline, except for a different set of ideas. Because again, go back to the Victorian era, the mid to late 19th century, more towards the late 19th century. You had the middle class moralizing about empire and how we need to go abroad, and you had the upper class who didn't want to get involved in empire too much because it was costing a lot of money and it was causing a lot of people to get, and the lower class didn't like it because it was their sons and their children who were getting sent abroad to fight in wars and whatever and go and die on some foreign shore for who knows what reason. But meanwhile, the middle class was saying, no, we need to do this because we need to civilize. Like, it's a moral imperative for us to go and civilize and give our culture to the backwards peoples.
Okay, and as a bit of this is just more of an aside, so maybe not related to the topic at all, but wasn't also the Victorian middle class at the time also very, I wouldn't even say Puritan, it was just very, kind of against degeneracy, wasn't it?
Yeah.
When, I feel like this is, like, not true, but I remember seeing something along the lines of saying that apparently, aristocratic Victorian women like to get nipple piercings.
I would not be surprised. Yeah, the aristocracy. I mean, some of it was just kind of getting caught up in the odd instances that there were, but there certainly was something to the idea that the aristocracy just kind of wanted to have fun. The middle class was constantly chastising them for it.
Yeah, well, the thing that makes me laugh is like the reasoning behind it. Apparently, was the Victorian women of the era believed it made their busts look bigger.
That's funny. I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, so that's what I mean. I'm not sure if it's true. It's one of those little tidbits that I saw a while ago, and I must have been a teenager when I saw it. Otherwise, it probably wouldn't have stuck in my head for as long as it has.
I feel like that's a bit of a tangent. Should we wrap it up?
I was gonna say, like, I blanked for just a second, and we had gone from British values to nipple piercings.
Look, I had to lighten the mood somehow.
All right, yeah, we'll call it there then. I'm sure this will come up in future talks. Because, well, actually, as one final thought that I'd like to give, part of the problem is that we were looking at this at such a high level that it's difficult to get into super specific things that would distinguish us as having British values on certain things. So, just to give a very, very quick example, if we were talking about British culinary culture, I would say there's an emphasis there on, when I say fast food, that has a certain stigma, but so for example, some of our national dishes revolve around like pasties and things, and that is very much
I didn't mean what you were talking about. I was like, he's talking about pastries.
Yeah, well, it was initially just a way of being able to carry lunch with you and have that as like a quick thing that you could just eat on the go. And you kind of see this in Japan as well, which is kind of interesting, where a lot of their national cuisine is revolving around something that you can just go and get quickly, eat it, and then go on to the next meeting or whatever. Stuff like that.
It's like the reason pies exist is because they stay warm for a long time, so they get made and then get sent down into a mine so that the miners don't have to come up for lunch, and it stays warm on the way down.
Yeah, exactly, things like that. Whereas when you on the continent, there's a lot more culture around, having a meal at dinner or like, a big lunch or something, and that's something that is made at home and consumed at home.
Wasn't the original pork pies and the more smaller handheld one? I believe there wasn't that like along the lines of to help people who wanted to eat something while riding on horseback or something. I can't remember.
I haven't heard that, but I wouldn't be surprised. Possibly the most surprising thing for me was that early on, pastries were supposed to be, so the actual pastry part of the pastry was supposed to be, the pastry part of the pasty, I should say, was supposed to be thrown away. You just eat the insides and then throw the rest away.
That's the best bit.
Yeah, well, I know it is now because we put loads of butter in it and things and actually give it flavour. But before, it would have basically just been flour and water.
Makes so much sense.
Yeah.
It actually makes a lot of sense now.
Like a portable bowl.
Yeah, more or less.
barbarians did have plates made out of bread, so that you eat whatever you're eating and then you eat the plate. So it's the perfect system. You leave nothing behind.
Yeah, that's the same.
Join us next week when we start talking about culinary delights.
Yeah,
I'd be
so
down for
I'm gonna say we are going way off track here.
everyone okay to turn this into a culinary podcast instead?
Hell yeah, man.
Sure. Although we do need to end this quick. I've been hanging from this candelabra so long the blood's rushed to my head.
All right then. See you next time, everyone, on a casual chat about cuisine.